The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial red tunic for what he believed would be another routine day of royal duties. At 62 years old, Thomas had served the crown for over 4 decades, earning respect and admiration from colleagues and royalty alike. His weathered face bore the marks of countless hours standing guard in all weather conditions, and his steel-gray eyes had witnessed history unfold before the palace gates. Thomas remembered the day he first laid eyes on the Queen's beloved Range Rover Defender. It was 1987, and he was a young guardsman assigned to vehicle security detail. The forest green SUV had just arrived at the castle, specially modified for Her Majesty's personal use. Unlike the formal state cars with their polished chrome and bulletproof glass, this Range Rover represented something different entirely. It was the Queen's escape vehicle, her connection to the countryside she loved so dearly. Over the years, Thomas watched as the Queen drove that Range Rover herself through the Scottish Highlands during summer visits to Balmoral. She would wave cheerfully at him as she passed, sometimes stopping to chat about the weather or ask about his family. The vehicle became more than just transportation. It was a symbol of the Queen's independent spirit and her desire to maintain some normalcy despite her royal status. The Range Rover held countless memories within its leather seats and sturdy frame. Thomas recalled the day Prince William and Prince Harry, still young boys, had convinced their grandmother to take them on an impromptu adventure through Windsor's vast parkland. The Queen had laughed as the boys pressed their faces against the windows, pointing excitedly at deer grazing in the distance. That same vehicle had carried the Queen to countless charity events, horse shows, and private family gatherings away from the public eye. As news of the Queen's passing spread throughout the kingdom in September 2022, Thomas felt a profound sense of loss that extended beyond his professional duties. He had not only lost his sovereign, but also a woman who had treated him with kindness and respect throughout his career. The days following her death were filled with ceremony and protocol, but also with quiet moments of reflection among the staff who had known her personally. The funeral proceedings were magnificent yet somber, attended by world leaders and royalty from across the globe. Thomas stood at attention during the service, his mind wandering occasionally to memories of the Queen's warm smile and her genuine interest in the lives of those who served her. He thought about her Range Rover, now sitting unused in the royal garage, a silent testament to a remarkable life lived with purpose and dignity. In the weeks that followed, discussions began about the Queen's personal effects and how they would be distributed or preserved. The royal family worked carefully through her belongings, ensuring that items of historical significance would be properly maintained for future generations. Some pieces would go to museums, others would remain within the family, and a select few would be gifted to trusted staff members who had served faithfully over the years. Thomas heard rumors circulating among the staff about various individuals expressing interest in acquiring pieces of the Queen's collection. Some requests were reasonable and came from appropriate channels, while others seemed opportunistic and disrespectful. The thought of people attempting to profit from the Queen's memory troubled him deeply, but he trusted that the royal family would handle such matters with appropriate care and consideration. One particular morning in November, Thomas was conducting his regular security rounds when he noticed unusual activity near the motor pool where the royal vehicles were housed. Several men in expensive suits were examining the cars with great interest, taking photographs and making notes on clipboards. Their behavior struck him as odd, as most official business regarding the vehicles would typically involve the royal household staff or authorized mechanics. As Thomas approached the group, he overheard fragments of conversation that made his blood run cold. The men were discussing the monetary value of various vehicles, treating them like commodities rather than cherished possessions of the late Queen. One man in particular seemed to be leading the discussion, speaking with an American accent and gesturing enthusiastically toward the Range Rover. The man appeared to be in his 70s, with an unmistakable orange-tinted complexion and carefully styled blonde hair. Thomas recognized him immediately from countless news broadcasts and newspaper headlines. This was Donald Trump, the former president of the United States, standing in the royal garage and examining the Queen's personal vehicles as if he were shopping at a luxury car dealership. Trump moved through the garage with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted, his entourage following closely behind. He paused at each vehicle, asking detailed questions about their specifications, history, and current market value. When he reached the Queen's Range Rover, his eyes lit up with unmistakable desire. "This is the one," Trump announced loudly, running his hand along the vehicle's hood. "This is exactly what I need for my collection at Mar-a-Lago. Imagine the stories this beauty could tell. The Queen herself drove this magnificent machine through the Scottish countryside. My guests would be absolutely amazed." Thomas felt his jaw clench as he listened to the former president speak about the Queen's beloved vehicle as if it were merely another trophy to be displayed. The casual way Trump discussed acquiring such a personal and meaningful possession showed a complete lack of understanding about what the Range Rover represented to those who had known and loved the Queen. "Sir, I believe there may be some confusion," one of Trump's assistants said quietly. "These vehicles belong to the royal family, and I don't believe they're available for purchase or acquisition by private collectors." Trump waved dismissively at the comment, his confidence unshaken. "Everything has a price, and I'm prepared to make a very generous offer. This Range Rover would be the crown jewel of my collection. I've already spoken with some people who assured me that arrangements could be made." The conversation continued as Trump's team took more photographs and measurements of the Range Rover. They discussed transportation logistics, insurance requirements, and display options with the casual efficiency of people who had acquired rare and valuable items many times before. Thomas realized with growing horror that this was not merely idle curiosity or wishful thinking. Trump genuinely believed he could purchase the Queen's personal vehicle. As the group prepared to leave, Trump turned to one of his assistants and said, "Contact my lawyers and have them draw up an official offer. I want this Range Rover, and I'm willing to pay whatever it takes to get it. The Queen was a remarkable woman, and this vehicle deserves to be properly appreciated by someone who understands its historical significance." Thomas struggled to maintain his composure as he watched the former president and his entourage exit the garage. The audacity of the request was staggering, but even more troubling was Trump's apparent belief that his wealth and status entitled him to acquire something so personally meaningful to the royal family. The Queen's Range Rover was not a museum piece or a commodity. It was a cherished possession that held decades of precious memories. That evening, Thomas returned to his modest apartment in Windsor, his mind racing with thoughts about what he had witnessed. He sat in his favorite chair, staring out the window at the castle grounds, where he had spent most of his adult life. The Queen's Range Rover remained in the garage, but for how long? If Trump was serious about his intentions, and if he had indeed spoken with people who could facilitate such an acquisition, then something needed to be done to protect the vehicle from falling into inappropriate hands. Thomas had always prided himself on following proper protocol and maintaining professional discretion, but this situation felt different. The Queen had trusted him to protect what mattered to her, and that responsibility didn't end with her passing. As he prepared for bed, Thomas made a decision that would change the course of events dramatically. He would not allow the Queen's beloved Range Rover to be treated as a collectible item for someone's private display. The memory of Her Majesty deserved better protection than that. The next morning would bring new challenges and difficult conversations, but Thomas felt a sense of purpose that had been missing since the Queen's death. He had found a way to honor her memory and protect something that had brought her joy during her lifetime. Whatever consequences might follow, he was prepared to face them with the same courage and dedication that had guided him throughout his career in service to the crown. The following Tuesday morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical November weather that matched Thomas Mitchell's somber mood as he made his way to Windsor Castle. He had spent the weekend researching proper protocols for reporting concerns about the royal collection, determined to handle the Trump situation through appropriate channels before taking any drastic action. His decades of service had taught him the value of following established procedures, even when his instincts urged him toward more immediate intervention. Thomas began his morning by requesting a private meeting with Colonel James Whitmore, the deputy master of the household, a position that carried significant authority over castle operations and staff matters. Colonel Whitmore was a fair man in his late 50s who had earned universal respect through his careful attention to both protocol and human nature. Thomas had worked with him on several security matters over the years and trusted his judgment completely. The meeting took place in Colonel Whitmore's oak-paneled office, surrounded by portraits of previous monarchs and certificates recognizing decades of faithful service. Thomas sat across from the colonel's massive mahogany desk, choosing his words carefully as he explained what he had witnessed in the royal garage. He described Trump's visit, the detailed examination of the vehicles, and the former president's explicit statements about wanting to acquire the Queen's Range Rover for his personal collection. Colonel Whitmore listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification about specific details or requesting Thomas to repeat particularly concerning statements. When Thomas finished his account, the colonel leaned back in his leather chair and sighed deeply, running his hand through his graying hair. The expression on his weathered face suggested that this was not entirely unexpected news, though no less troubling for its predictability. "I appreciate your bringing this to my attention. Thomas," Colonel Whitmore said finally, "unfortunately, you're not the first person to raise concerns about Mr. Trump's interest in the royal collection. We've received several unofficial inquiries through various intermediaries over the past few weeks, all seemingly designed to test our receptiveness to private sales or donations of the Queen's personal effects." The colonel explained that Trump's representatives had been remarkably persistent in their efforts to gain access to the Queen's possessions, using a combination of flattery, financial incentives, and name-dropping to try to open doors that should have remained firmly closed. They had contacted former staff members, retired courtiers, and even distant royal family connections in their quest to find someone willing to facilitate a transaction. "The audacity is breathtaking," Colonel Whitmore continued, "but not entirely surprising given Mr. Trump's well-documented history of pursuing items that catch his fancy, regardless of their availability or appropriateness. What concerns me most is his apparent belief that sufficient financial pressure will eventually overcome any resistance to his acquisition attempts." Thomas felt a mix of relief and growing anger as he learned about the scope of Trump's efforts. Relief that his concerns were being taken seriously by the appropriate authorities, but anger that the former president was treating the Queen's memory with such casual disrespect. The idea that Trump viewed the royal collection as a shopping opportunity was deeply offensive to everyone who had known and served the Queen personally. Colonel Whitmore assured Thomas that all official channels had been properly informed about Trump's interest and that appropriate measures were being taken to protect the royal collection from any unauthorized acquisition attempts. However, he also cautioned that Trump's wealth and international connections meant that the situation required careful monitoring and potentially creative security measures to ensure complete protection. As their meeting concluded, Colonel Whitmore made a request that both honored Thomas's dedication and acknowledged the seriousness of the situation. He asked Thomas to serve as the primary security liaison for the Queen's personal vehicles, giving him additional authority to monitor access and report any suspicious activity immediately. This unofficial promotion reflected the colonel's confidence in Thomas's judgment and his understanding of the personal investment that longtime staff members had in protecting the Queen's legacy. Thomas accepted the additional responsibility with pride and determination, viewing it as both an honor and a sacred trust. He spent the remainder of that week implementing enhanced security protocols for the motor pool, including updated access logs, improved surveillance coverage, and more frequent patrols during off hours. These measures were designed to detect and deter any unauthorized attempts to examine or remove the vehicles. The enhanced security proved its worth sooner than expected. The following Monday morning, Thomas discovered evidence that someone had attempted to gain unauthorized access to the garage during the weekend. Security cameras revealed two men in dark clothing attempting to pick the lock on a side entrance that was rarely used by authorized personnel. While their faces were not clearly visible, their professional approach and specialized equipment suggested this was not a random break-in attempt. More troubling still, the intruders had focused their attention specifically on the area where the Queen's Range Rover was stored, examining it carefully with flashlights and taking what appeared to be detailed measurements of the vehicle and surrounding space. They had also placed small electronic devices near the vehicle, which Thomas's security sweep later identified as tracking beacons designed to monitor the Range Rover's location and movement. The discovery of the tracking devices confirmed Thomas's worst fears about the lengths to which Trump might be willing to go in pursuing the Queen's vehicle. This was no longer simply a matter of inappropriate requests through semi-official channels. It had escalated into potential criminal activity involving surveillance equipment and attempted breaking and entering. The situation required immediate escalation to higher authorities and more serious security countermeasures. Thomas immediately contacted both Colonel Whitmore and the castle's security chief, providing detailed reports about the discovered devices and the implications for the royal collection's safety. Within hours, specialist security teams were conducting comprehensive sweeps of all royal vehicles and storage areas, discovering additional surveillance equipment that had apparently been planted during previous unauthorized visits. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern of surveillance and intelligence gathering that extended well beyond simple interest in acquiring collectible items. Someone with significant resources and sophisticated capabilities had been systematically mapping the castle's security protocols, vehicle storage procedures, and staff schedules in preparation for what appeared to be a planned acquisition operation. Meanwhile, Trump's public statements about his interest in royal memorabilia became increasingly bold and problematic. During a television interview that week, he spoke enthusiastically about his ongoing negotiations to acquire several pieces from the Queen's collection, describing them as incredible investments that would honor her memory in the most beautiful way possible. He made specific reference to her Range Rover, calling it the ultimate driving machine with the most incredible provenance imaginable. These public statements created additional pressure on the royal household to issue clear denials about any negotiations or potential sales, but they also revealed the extent of Trump's misunderstanding about the situation. He appeared genuinely convinced that his offers would eventually be accepted, either through financial pressure or political influence, and his confidence suggested that someone had been encouraging his beliefs about the feasibility of such acquisitions. The situation reached a critical point when Colonel Whitmore received a formal written offer from Trump's legal representatives proposing to purchase the Queen's Range Rover for what they described as a sum that reflects both its historical significance and current market value. The offer included detailed provisions for transportation, insurance, and public display, treating the transaction as a straightforward commercial deal between willing parties. The legal document revealed the depth of research that Trump's team had conducted into the Queen's vehicle preferences, driving habits, and the Range Rover's modification history. They had somehow obtained detailed maintenance records, photographs from private family events, and even quotes from former staff members about the Queen's attachment to the vehicle. This level of detailed intelligence gathering raised serious questions about how such private information had been obtained and what other breaches of royal privacy might have occurred. Thomas felt his anger building as he read through the legal proposal, which treated the Queen's beloved Range Rover as nothing more than a valuable collectible to be acquired and displayed. The clinical language of the contract stood in stark contrast to his memories of the Queen driving that same vehicle through Windsor's grounds. Her face lit up with the simple joy of being behind the wheel of her favorite car. That evening, Thomas made a decision that would define his legacy and demonstrate the depth of his loyalty to the Queen's memory. He would not simply wait for official channels to resolve the situation through diplomatic niceties and legal procedures. The Queen had trusted him to protect what mattered to her, and he would honor that trust even if it meant risking his career and reputation in the process. As he prepared for what might be his final week of service at Windsor Castle, Thomas began planning a confrontation that would send an unmistakable message about the inviolability of the Queen's memory and the determination of those who had served her faithfully. Trump's arrogance and persistence had pushed the situation beyond the bounds of normal diplomatic resolution, and Thomas was prepared to respond with the kind of direct action that the circumstances demanded. Thursday morning dawned crisp and clear. With autumn sunlight streaming through the ancient windows of Windsor Castle, as Thomas Mitchell prepared for what he knew would be the most significant day of his 4-decade career. Intelligence from multiple sources had confirmed that Trump planned to make another visit to the castle that afternoon, this time accompanied by what his representatives described as transportation specialists, who would conduct a final assessment of the Queen's Range Rover before completing the acquisition process. The audacity of Trump's assumption that his offer would be accepted had reached staggering proportions. His team had already begun making arrangements for the vehicle's transport to the United States, including custom shipping containers, insurance policies, and import documentation. They had even started planning a media event to showcase the Range Rover's arrival at Mar-a-Lago, complete with detailed descriptions of how it would be displayed and the stories that would be told about the Queen's driving adventures. Thomas spent the morning reviewing every detail of his plan, knowing that he would have only one opportunity to deliver the message that needed to be heard. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his brass buttons polished to a mirror shine, and his ceremonial sword properly positioned according to regulations that had been unchanged for generations. If this was to be his final act as a royal guard, it would be performed with all the dignity and precision that his position demanded. Colonel Whitmore had briefed Thomas about the official royal household position regarding Trump's visit, which would be courteous but firm in its rejection of any acquisition proposals. However, Thomas understood that diplomatic language and polite refusals had already proven ineffective against Trump's persistent campaign to acquire the Queen's possessions. More direct action was required to convey the depth of offense that his requests had caused among those who had known and served the Queen personally. At precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Trump's motorcade arrived at Windsor Castle with the kind of fanfare typically reserved for visiting heads of state. The former president emerged from his limousine wearing an expensive dark suit and his characteristic red tie, flanked by a small army of assistants, lawyers, and what appeared to be automotive specialists carrying sophisticated equipment for vehicle assessment and transportation planning. Thomas positioned himself strategically near the entrance to the motor pool, ensuring that he would have a clear line of sight to the Queen's Range Rover while remaining close enough to intervene if necessary. His heart pounded with a mixture of nervous energy and righteous anger as he watched Trump's entourage make their way toward the royal garage, their confident demeanor suggesting they viewed this visit as a mere formality before taking possession of their prize. Trump moved through the garage with the same proprietary air that Thomas had observed during his previous visit, but this time his behavior was even more presumptuous. He spoke to his companions as if the acquisition was already complete, describing how the Range Rover would be displayed at Mar-a-Lago and the impact it would have on his guests. His casual references to the Queen as a remarkable lady who really knew quality struck Thomas as particularly offensive in their superficial understanding of her character and values. "This beautiful machine is going to be the centerpiece of my collection," Trump announced loudly as he approached the Range Rover. "Nobody appreciates fine automobiles like I do, and this one has the most incredible history. The Queen drove this herself through Scotland, can you imagine? My guests are going to be absolutely amazed when they see it." The automotive specialists began their detailed examination of the vehicle, checking everything from the engine specifications to the condition of the leather seats that had once held the Queen during countless drives through the countryside she loved. They took photographs from every angle, recorded detailed measurements, and even tested various mechanical components to ensure the vehicle would be ready for its transatlantic journey. Thomas watched in growing horror as these strangers treated the Queen's beloved Range Rover like a commodity being prepared for sale. Their clinical approach to examining what had been such a personal and cherished possession demonstrated a complete failure to understand the emotional and historical significance of what they were handling. This was not just a valuable automobile, it was a tangible connection to the Queen's private life and personal happiness. The breaking point came when one of the specialists suggested that certain modifications might be necessary to adapt the Range Rover for display purposes, including the installation of explanatory plaques and protective barriers that would prevent visitors from touching the vehicle. The casual way they discussed altering the Queen's personal automobile to suit Trump's exhibition needs pushed Thomas beyond his ability to remain silent. "Excuse me, sir," Thomas said, stepping forward with the measured pace and authoritative bearing that had been drilled into him during decades of ceremonial duty. His voice carried the kind of crisp military precision that immediately commanded attention from everyone in the garage. Trump turned toward Thomas with mild curiosity, apparently expecting to receive assistance or information from what he assumed was a helpful staff member. His expression suggested that he was accustomed to having his needs anticipated and accommodated by those around him, particularly when conducting business involving expensive acquisitions. "You are Thomas Mitchell, I presume," Trump said with a confident smile, extending his hand as if greeting an old friend. "I understand you've been taking excellent care of this magnificent Range Rover. I want you to know that it's going to have a wonderful new home in Florida where millions of people will be able to appreciate its history and significance." Thomas ignored the extended hand, his steel-gray eyes fixed directly on Trump's face with an intensity that had been forged through 4 decades of unwavering service to the crown. When he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of his authority as a senior member of the royal household and his deep personal investment in protecting the Queen's memory. "Mr. Trump," Thomas said, his words cutting through the garage's ambient noise like a blade through silk, "I am here to inform you that your interest in Her late Majesty's personal possessions is not only inappropriate but deeply offensive to everyone who had the honor of knowing and serving her." The transformation in Thomas's demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. Gone was any pretense of diplomatic courtesy or professional deference. In its place stood a man whose loyalty to his sovereign transcended any consideration of political correctness or career consequences. His uniform, his bearing, and his unwavering gaze all conveyed the same message. This was hallowed ground, and Trump was trespassing on sacred memory. Trump's confident expression faltered slightly as he recognized that this was not going to be the routine interaction he had anticipated. The authority in Thomas's voice and the steel in his eyes suggested that this conversation was going to proceed on terms very different from what he was accustomed to experiencing in business negotiations. "Now, I'm sure we can work something out," Trump began, falling back on the negotiating tactics that had served him in countless other situations. "I'm prepared to make a very generous offer, and I think you'll find that everyone benefits when reasonable people come together to find solutions." "There will be no solution, Mr. Trump!" Thomas's voice exploded through the garage with a volume and intensity that stopped all other conversation immediately. Every person in the building turned toward the confrontation, startled by the sudden eruption of barely controlled fury from the normally composed royal guard. Her late Majesty's Range Rover is not for sale, not for trade, and not available for inclusion in your personal collection under any circumstances whatsoever, Thomas continued, his voice rising with each word as 40 years of suppressed frustration at entitled behavior finally found its target. The audacity of your assumption that everything has a price and can be acquired for your personal gratification is an insult to the memory of the finest woman who ever lived. Trump stepped backward, clearly shocked by the vehemence of Thomas's response and uncertain how to handle a situation where his wealth and status carried no weight whatsoever. His usual confident demeanor crumbled as he faced someone whose loyalty and principles could not be purchased or influenced by any amount of money or pressure. This vehicle represents 40 years of memories, 40 years of service, and 40 years of dedication to something greater than personal profit. Thomas's voice echoed off the garage walls as his emotions reached their peak. The Queen trusted me to protect what mattered to her, and I will not allow her memory to be diminished by your treating her possessions like trophies for your entertainment. The silence that followed Thomas's outburst was deafening. Every person in the garage stood frozen, witnessing a moment that would be remembered and retold for years to come. Trump's automotive specialists stopped their examinations and stepped away from the Range Rover, suddenly aware that they were standing in the middle of something much more significant than a simple vehicle acquisition. Furthermore, Thomas continued, his voice now controlled but no less intense, your persistent efforts to circumvent official channels, your surveillance activities, and your complete disregard for appropriate protocol demonstrate a fundamental failure to understand what service and honor mean to those of us who have dedicated our lives to something greater than ourselves. Trump attempted to regain his composure, perhaps hoping to salvage the situation through charm or negotiation, but Thomas was far from finished. The months of watching Trump's increasingly aggressive attempts to acquire the Queen's possessions had built up a reservoir of anger that was now flowing freely. You speak of honoring the Queen's memory while simultaneously treating her most personal possessions as collectible items for your private display, Thomas said, his words cutting deep into Trump's justifications. You fail to understand that true honor comes from preservation and respect, not from ownership and exhibition for personal aggrandizement. The confrontation continued for several more minutes, with Thomas methodically dismantling every argument and justification that Trump attempted to offer. By the time the former president and his entourage finally departed Windsor Castle, there was no doubt whatsoever about the royal household's position regarding any potential acquisition of the Queen's personal effects. As the motorcade disappeared down the castle's tree-lined drive, Thomas stood alone in the garage beside the Queen's Range Rover, his duty finally complete. He had protected what mattered most to her, defended her memory against those who would diminish it, and demonstrated that some things in life remain beyond the reach of money and influence. The consequences of his actions would unfold in the days and weeks to come, but Thomas felt a deep sense of satisfaction that transcended any concerns about his professional future. He had kept faith with the Queen who had trusted him, honored the principles that had guided his 4 decades of service, and sent an unmistakable message about the difference between true loyalty and mere transactional relationships. The Queen's Range Rover would remain exactly where it belonged, preserved as a testament to her memory and protected by those who understood its true value. And Thomas Mitchell would be remembered not just as a loyal servant of the Crown, but as a man who stood up for what was right when it mattered most.